Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and I'll be your host today. And today it's my pleasure to have with me here in the studios of GNAT two of our local state representatives to the state legislature. To my right is Cynthia Browning, who is one of our two state representatives from the district that includes Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and most of Sunderland. To my left is Jeff Wilson, who is the other state representative in our two-member district. Welcome to all of you, and I guess, Cynthia, Jeff, this is kind of our bookend session, I guess you could say in a way. Back in January, we met together with Patty Comline and Tim Goodwin. We'll have the two of them on a separate show, I hope, sometime soon, to talk about what your expectations were about the upcoming legislative session at that point. Well, here we are at the end. The legislature adjourned a couple of weeks ago, and I guess now would be a good time to kind of hear from you both about what your reactions and thoughts were about the session that just concluded. So, Cynthia, let me start with you. What were your overall assessments of the session? Was it a good one, a mediocre one? Were there any important accomplishments or any major disappointments that you felt came out of the session?
Well, I think that one thing that people should understand is that we are still doing things in the legislature related to Irene recovery, and there were a number of things in terms of dealing with companies that had to lay people off and had unemployment insurance issues. There have been issues with the state facilities. We're still rebuilding and recovering from Irene. We're still dealing with road problems related to Irene. So the legislature tried to keep on top of that and keep cleaning that up. And I think that's very important for our area because there were Irene-related problems. In terms of the session overall, I'm glad that there weren't more tax increases than there were. I'm glad that we ended up kind of holding the line on budget spending, but I'm grievously disappointed that we didn't actually do any tax reform. And I also feel that the legislature has a pattern of doing things that are well-intentioned but may not really work. And I see a lot of influence of special interests. And if I could just say one more thing that I was happy about, the Appropriations Committee is interested in my idea of looking at how the state allocates resources with the budget money, the money that goes in tax subsidies, and the capital bill money all in one place. So for instance, if you take University of Vermont, we all support University of Vermont, it's very important to us. University of Vermont gets budget money, $40 million. They get a tax exemption on property taxes of at least $10 million, and then they get $1.5 million in the capital bill. So if you're saying, okay, UVM gets $40 million, no, actually they don't. They get 52. And you need to look at these things all in one place in order to be sure that we're allocating resources properly and getting the most bang for the buck. So the Appropriations Committee actually is interested in doing that, and someone from the administration is interested in doing that. And to me, that's a first step in really understanding how we're spending our money, is to really have it all in one place.
All right. Well, I got a funny feeling we may return to that subject in some more depth, I don't know, in a moment or two. But Jeff, let's hear from you. Any strong feelings one way or the other, pro or con, about the legislature? Good, bad, indifferent, or things that you would have liked to have seen that get through that didn't?
Well, I think it was a pretty good session. I wouldn't typify it as great, but it was good in the sense that I think things were fairly orderly, very civil. We did get out in 17 weeks, didn't drag into June or July. God help us. So from that perspective, things proceeded fairly well, and I think, as I say, civil, courteous, respectful discussion and debate throughout. There could have been, obviously, more accomplishments. We were limited, I suppose, to some degree, given our financial capacity or lack thereof. Good deal of discussion about taxes and spending this year, but in the long run, there wasn't much done in reference to increasing taxes, except for the gas tax, which was sorely needed given our road system and needs for our bridges and infrastructure. But not much in the way of any other tax increases whatsoever, nor, and I share Cynthia's feelings, did we accomplish anything meaningful in the arena of tax reform. So, you know, it was a mixed bag in the sense that the budget was balanced. There were no new programs. There was overwhelming support for the budget in the long run because it didn't include any revenue enhancements in the general fund, and it passed by, I think, 128 to 9, which is overwhelming. But we didn't tackle a number of things that one might want to tackle, such as pre-K, which I think in the long run is going to be an important investment for the state of Vermont in expanding pre-K opportunities. And something that I think is, I feel strongly about is thermal efficiency, and trying to do something more aggressive in the area of insulating homes and conserving energy. At the offset of the session, both the governor and the speaker spoke quite a bit about trying to make that one of the higher priorities, but it never really came together in the end.
Well, let's continue on and talk a little bit about pre-kindergarten education or pre-K education. That was one idea that surfaced early. The governor mentioned it in one of his early addresses. It seemed like there's a lot of support for the idea, but in the end it didn't happen. How many schools in Vermont would that bill have actually affected? And is there some dollar figure attached to how much it would cost to make that, I guess, mandatory, or how would it work? Would it be that every school district would have to offer a pre-K program, or would it still be somehow optional?
Well, the bill as it passed the House, and it went through a few iterations in the House, would require that every school district would have to offer 10 hours of pre-K. Publicly funded pre-K.
It wouldn't be mandatory on the part of parents to
That's
send
right, correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now, I think a majority of school districts do offer it to some degree. Manchester has been out front in that regard because they do offer full-time pre-K, and the experience there has been extraordinarily positive in the sense that kids who go to pre-K are better prepared for kindergarten. Less in the way of costs associated with special education. And if you look at some of the data, and I know that's questionable, but the long term, the pay back to society is, some studies would suggest 7 to 1 for each dollar expended. You're going to save $7 in the long run in future years. So it was a priority in the long run, though. I guess, well, when it made it eventually to the Senate, there was a question of where the monies would come from. I think short term, the thought was it would cost $1.2 million or something like that in the near term, but that would increase in the out years. So there's reluctance to try to do that within the budgetary constraints that we saw this year.
Okay. Well. $1.2 million doesn't sound like a whole lot if that's what the projection was to cost. But I know that education spending was another issue that was bubbling up a little bit. You had a large, well, by historical standards anyway, a 5 to 6 cent increase in the education base rate property tax. You also passed a bill that called for reining in school spending to some degree by lowering the threshold of the penalty area from 125% of the state average down to 121% by fiscal year 2017. Cynthia, let me ask you, what was your sense on that front with pre-kindergarten spending and the whole educational spending situation in general?
Well, in terms of the pre-K, it's important to know that if eventually 60% of all of Vermont students were in pre-K, the total pre-K cost would be $24 million. And this would be that every school district offered it, and then it's up to parents in terms of whether they enroll their kids. So right now it costs $14 million. So by like 2016 or 2018, if 60% of Vermont children were enrolled, it will cost $24 million. And that is in the education fund. So I actually had an amendment to the pre-K bill that would have said starting now, any increase in pre-K costs would have to be funded by the general fund transfer. Because the pre-K spending, we all know that this is a valuable program, but the state is once again telling the towns you have to do this without putting up any extra money. And I don't like that. I don't like that. And it's part of this whole pattern in which the state blames the school districts and the towns for rising education taxes, education spending, and says we have to raise property taxes, it's all your fault. Whereas in fact, the state continually puts mandates on the school districts that force up costs. and then shorts the general fund transfer, the education fund, because they rebased how they calculate that in the last couple of years. So if they raise the property tax rates like 5 cents or 6 cents this year, 2 or 3 cents of that, in my mind, is because of the state's failure to property fund the ed fund. So if this really is a priority for the governor, pre-K, college, education in general, then don't you think he'd want to put his money where his mouth is and fully fund the general fund transfer? No, he wouldn't. Apparently not. And the increase in the property tax is a broad-based tax increase, even though he doesn't want to call it that.
What exactly is a broad-based tax?
It's in the eyes of the beholder. Okay, I think it's a tax that affects most people,
right.
And that would include the gas tax, the
right.
property tax, the income tax, the sales tax.
Okay.
You know, but that's not the way the governor sees it.
Okay. So, Cynthia, you just to follow up on that, you were very vocal during the session, and as you have been for the past couple of years, about trying to do something about so-called tax expenditures or loopholes or carve-outs that get into the budget, exemptions, subsidies for certain special interests that have been deemed to be economically or politically important. You would like to see, as I understand it, some kind of sweeping overhaul of that, or at least a pruning or cleaning out. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure.
And do you think it's realistic? I guess my follow-up would be, in 2014, next year, an election year, to see some kind of sweeping overhaul like that really gain much traction.
Well, I did introduce a bill, H353, if somebody wants to look it up, that would have looked at income taxes and the property tax rate. And what it would have done is it would have eliminated the tax expenditures, the credits, deductions, and exemptions in both the property tax and the income tax as much as possible. That's, of course, an important phrase, as much as possible, and lowered all the rates. See, this is one of the important things about tax reform to me, is that you should be trying to present it as more or less revenue neutral so that you're not just raising the amount people pay. So if you did that, and then one of the things is we have a lot of our tax expenditures, the credits, the deductions or the subsidies, there's policy goals there. For instance, income sensitivity is supposed to help people pay their property taxes and stay in their homes. Current use is supposed to protect agricultural and forestry. Those are important policy goals. The problem is they're in the education fund and they're not education. And every time the property tax rate goes up, the amount it costs to pay the subsidy for the property tax payments for both of those policies goes up. So it's like a vicious cycle. So if you take those out, the cost of the programs goes down because the property tax rate goes down. So 353 actually does that and then funds new programs related to agriculture and income sensitivity outside of the education fund. So it takes some of the extra revenue to fund those.
Would the overall idea be, though, to try and eliminate some of these exemptions so that you could lower the basic rate?
Yes.
So
Yes. So the top rate could go from like 8.95 to maybe 7.5.
Okay.
The bottom rate could go from 3.5 to maybe 2. I mean, it all depends on how you do it.
Right.
But the numbers work. I went through JFO and he said your numbers work.
Joint Fiscal Office?
The Joint Fiscal Office.
Right.
He said your numbers work. Your politics may not work.
Right.
And so that's the problem. But the most fascinating thing is that Ways and Means did end up, and Senate Finance too, did end up talking about doing this just with the income tax. So I think people really understand that the amount that is going out of the revenue picture for all these subsidies, it's not that they're bad or there's anything wrong with them. It's just that we're not being good stewards. We have to look at them, make sure that the programs are working the way we want and have better accountability. Because remember, the tax expenditures overall are $1.2 billion. Our whole budget is like, what is it, $5 billion?
5.3.
Okay, so that's a lot of money to not really be keeping track of.
Well, Jeff, you're in the Ways and Means Committee in the House, so I assume that your committee would probably be involved if there were some kind of initiative along those lines. Do you see that as something that your committee would be able to work with, or how would that go forward from there?
Well, we have Actually, let me back up to some degree. Looking back at 2010, we had the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission. And a lot of those same ideas that are articulated by Representative Browning were recommended by the Blue Ribbon Commission, both in reference to the sales tax and the income tax. So yeah, we have really tried to do the best that we can as far as limiting new tax expenditures, but also trying to get a handle on existing ones. And it's not easy because every tax expenditure has its own constituency and special interest group that's advocating on their behalf.
They're not shy about reminding you about how important it is to the Vermont economy.
Absolutely. But I thought this year we did, well, let me give you a little, it was quite a saga this year when you're talking about revenue and spending. Initially back in January, February, the economy was looking a little shaky as far as revenue growth goes. We were told that we needed to raise an additional $20+ million to balance the general fund budget. So we did that in Ways and Means. It passed the House. Went to the Senate. The picture got a little rosier, so they reduced that amount that they were going to raise to $10 million. And then ultimately the Speaker, the President Pro Tem, and the governor agreed that, well, with a very bright, I guess it was March, or was it, March, I think, revenue forecast, could have been April forecast, the numbers came in that really were quite a bit better than anybody anticipated. And so the ultimate deal is, well, we don't need that $10 million, so we're going to just not raise any taxes in the general fund, balance the budget, and that's it. But in the context of all that discussion, there was a lot that was discussed in reference to not just raising taxes, but also reforming the tax system. And both in Ways and Means and, as Cynthia said, in Senate Finance, both parties, both different committees, did suggest tax reform ideas along the lines of at least capping certain deductions. And ultimately, even after the grand deal, where they said they were going to raise new revenue at the end of the session, Senate Finance and House Ways and Means, through the conference committee, which I was on, actually came up with an idea that became very controversial about capping deductions at 2.5 times the standard deduction. And what that would do is essentially limit those tax expenditures and use the monies that would be realized to reduce rates for everybody. That was an idea that the conferees embraced, and for a while the leadership in the legislature embraced. But the governor thought, as he said, it was done on the fly. He must have said that about 2 dozen times, even though we have discussed this concept, back since 2010. And so he really argued aggressively against any last-minute changes, and the long and short of it is you won the day. But the discussion's not over. The conference committee is still open. We can come back in January conceivably and do something, although recent comments by the governor would suggest that he's still not feeling too warm and fuzzy about this idea.
Okay. Well, let's turn to another issue that bubbled up during the session. It seemed at one point to be ready to kind of gain passage, but ultimately I guess it didn't. Campaign finance reform. I know there's a lot of discussion about that, particularly in the Senate, but you folks over in the House also passed a bill on that. Where are we at with that now? I think your bill in the House capped so-called super PAC donations at $5,000. This is kind of in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, which was very controversial, as we all know. Do you think there's any real impetus going forward again in next year for further action on this, or the Senate coming back to kind of take that idea up again and pass it, and between both houses you'd all come together on a bill that would gain passage?
I think that there's a lot of concern about this issue. I think we all know that disproportionate expenditures of money and contributions can really affect things, but we need to be careful in terms of the constitutional provisions about free speech. So I think both of the committees have been working really hard to try to craft something that would put some kind of limits on both contributions to candidates, parties, and PACs, and from them to candidates that would pass muster. And I think the different houses had different limits, or whether parties could do, and there were just different disagreements about it. But there were also a lot of disagreements within the Senate about it in terms of the role of corporations. My what I think is most urgent, even if we can't pass that, is we have to put in place some sort of real-time reporting system so that even if we're not going to regulate or cap some of the contributions, people can find out who's contributing to candidates in a much more timely way through an online database. And that was part of this bill. The Secretary of State would have been able to put that up, and so that during the campaign you could get much better information in a much more timely way. Because sunlight is a great purifier, and even if we're not going to cap contributions, if at least we know who's getting what, that's really important. So I think it's a tragedy if that provision does not move. And one of the reasons I think it's so important, just as we were talking about in terms of taxes, I see the role of special interests in the legislature more and more the longer I'm there. Last year, Green Mountain Power hired every single lobbyist who ever works in the State House to try to prevent us from making them pay back that $21 million. I'm serious. You always have some lobbyists. They hired every single lobbying firm. And this year, it was the unions that were everywhere, along with the different special interests for the tax provisions. Right. Now, some people may think, well, if you have all these competing special interests, out of that will emerge, some sort of balanced public interest. No. Okay? What I see is the competing special interests each get some or all of what they want at the expense of the true public interest, at the expense of the ordinary Vermonters. And that's one of the reasons why campaign finance reform of some kind, at the very least, revealing the contributions, is essential. Because people need to understand the extent to which what politicians do in office may be influenced by who's supporting them with money. Because I'm very, very serious about this. I think that we end up doing things that, although they may benefit Vermonters in general a little bit, or they may not hurt them too much, mostly they benefit the special interests. And that's because they have the money and they have the presence in the State House. And I deeply resent it.
So Jeff, transparency, that's the key ingredient here that we want to see out of any new bill, that an ordinary citizen can go online or whatever and find out who's supporting who and to what extent?
I think so. I think that's a key factor, and it should be better than it is now. And in fact, I think it makes sense right now. You don't even have to report if it's under $100 who it comes from, and I think every contribution should be delineated as to where it came from, who made it, if it was a PAC, a special interest group, an individual, whatever. I'm hopeful that, well, I would like to see additional movement relative to campaign finance reform. There's way too much money in politics, not so much in Vermont, let's face it, but nationally. And unfortunately, we are hamstrung by some constitutional issues now that the Supreme Court has weighed in relative to Citizens
Right, well, that
United.
whole business about the putting a limit on donations, doesn't that kind of run directly counter to what the Supreme Court said was
Some would have suggested that, yes. And
Yeah,
there's some debate about that, but I think that would certainly be litigated. And from my perspective, I don't take money from lobbyists. I don't take money, and never taken money from PACs, unions, corporations, or even the party. But that's just me. But I think it's important for the citizens to know exactly where campaign finance funding is coming from, and so the more we can develop a transparent and more a system that is more user-friendly, the better off we'll be.
Well, we're coming near the end of our time here, but I did want to ask one other question on an issue that I think a lot of folks are concerned about, and that's a bill that would control, I guess, or at least put limits on, or try to revitalize a system where physicians could keep track of what prescription drugs are prescribed. I guess there's a program in place now, but it's not being widely used, and there was one bill that you all were considering that would have, I guess, revitalized that, opiate abuse legislation as well. One of the most interesting statistics I heard from Senator Dick Sears when I was up in Montpelier a month or so ago was this idea that it costs $97,000 for a heroin addict in Vermont to basically maintain that habit. So I'm assuming there aren't too many heroin addicts who are pulling down close to six figures in their job, so that implies that to support that kind of a habit involves a lot of crime, petty or otherwise. I'm asking a couple of different questions here at once, and I apologize for that, but I guess I'm just wondering, do you think that this is an issue that, again, next year in a political year, we will see some interest in? Because the other part of the conversation I had with Senator Sears at the time involved the fact that there's no treatment facility down here in Bennington County that would help folks who might need that help. And I guess part of that bill might be bringing some kind of, if not a treatment center or methadone clinic, then some kind of a program that would make support more widely available. So Cynthia, I'll start with you.
Well, I believe both houses did pass the opioid abuse bill, and that had a number of different components. One of them was to try to use this Vermont prescription monitoring service. And what that means is that there'd be a record of if I went and I got some form of opiate, pain relief medication, that if I went to another doctor to ask for another prescription, the second doctor would be able to check and see that I'd just gotten another prescription, and so he'd have reason to say, okay, what's going on here? Are you doctor shopping? Are you getting lots of prescriptions? Do you have a problem? And have that whole conversation and maybe nip something in the bud. So that system has existed, but doctors haven't been using it enough. Pharmacists haven't been using it enough. So the idea is to really require them to use it more. The problem is we didn't take the next step, which is to allow better access by law enforcement. Law enforcement can get information from pharmacists about opiate prescriptions now, but they have to go from pharmacy to pharmacy and pharmacy. Last year, we considered allowing special drug investigators to have better access to this system so that they could look for patterns of abuse. The House is unwilling to do this. So I think they did something that was good. What they did was good, but they didn't go far enough to allow law enforcement access to this. Now, I understand that we're not going to wrest our way out of this. I understand that this is a health problem, but we need to allow law enforcement controlled access to this kind of information as a matter of community safety. The doctors are not going to be able to necessarily catch all of the abuse while it's happening and while people are engaged in robberies to support their habit. So what we did was good. We also provided for they call it a Good Samaritan, where if you think someone is taking an overdose, you can call 911. You won't get arrested. You won't get in trouble. We allowed for people to have something called Narcan, I think, on hand, which is an overdose antidote. But I still feel that the essential thing is don't even get started, and we have to do more somehow to prevent people from trying this stuff. And I know that the whole don't just say no to drugs thing, I mean, I'm not sure we can say the extent to which that worked, but I think young people need to understand, or anybody needs to understand, that when you start using these substances, you are they are going to steal your brain, and they're going to steal your body. And you just don't even go there. I think that in terms of the treatment, Rutland is going to have a treatment facility as a kind of a hub and spoke. So they may be a hub, and we might be able to have some sort of subsidiary thing down here. But I don't know that that is necessarily established now.
Any thoughts on that bill, Jeff? Or?
Well, I think it was a good bill, no doubt about it. But it's a tough problem to deal with, and there's been some success relative to prescription drug abuse. But unfortunately, there's been a migration from prescription drug abuse to heroin, and heroin use is increasing. It's a problem, and treatment is an issue here. Folks who have a problem with heroin addiction in Bennington, have to go, I guess, over to Brattleboro or other places for methadone, and that creates a problem. And certainly, if you don't have that treatment option locally, then you're looking at the potential of just that abuse occurring. So it's a problem. It's really one of the foremost problems we have to deal with in the state, and the state is responding, but there's more we should be doing.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. A lot of other issues that you dealt with, ridgeline development of wind turbines and renewable energy, the health exchange that's coming up. You guys will have a lot to work on when you reconvene in Montpelier next January, but
Absolutely.
you've got 5 or 6 months to think about that and rest up.
All right.
Thank you all for watching today. This has been The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever. It's been my pleasure to be here with Jeff Wilson and Cynthia Browning, representatives to the state legislature from our area. Thanks for watching. We'll see you the next time.